After less than 2 months in office, President Trump has been escalating U.S. military actions in the Middle East, along with recent attacks in Yemen and more advisors in Afghanistan. The president sending ground troops into Syria for an offensive against ISIS. As with President Obama, the involvement is explained as protecting American interests against terrorism. Our guest has long questioned the policy through his involvement in a series of weekly vigils in Boston that go back to the time of President Clinton. We'd like to welcome a member of the Committee for Human Rights, James Van Looy. Thank you very much for being with us, James. Yes. First of all, talk about your own military experience, because a lot of the people involved in these vigils were in the military.
I was drafted in 1966, and actually at that time, even when I registered to go for the draft, in many ways I already felt like a conscientious objector. However, I had never been away from home, and I also felt like it wasn't right to be excluded from service even by a college deferment. At that time, of course, you could have gotten one. So I actually dropped out of college and allowed myself to be drafted. That seemed like the most honorable thing I could do at that time.
Now, you were in Thailand?
I was served in Okinawa mostly. I was in a signal unit there, and we did temporary duty twice down in Thailand as part of CETO exercises. And also, they were building a huge road at that time, centrally up through Thailand, and so we did exercises up there as part of all of that activity that was going on.
Well, you managed not to be in those horrors in Vietnam, but how did your experience shape your sense of what's going on now?
Well, being in the military, especially in a time of war, I would say for anyone is a traumatic experience, because people all around you are being affected, pulled away, taken off to places where there is the war going on. I had two guys who were in my unit who were both wounded in Vietnam, for example, who were sent back to Japan for medical treatment and then served out the rest of their time in service in Okinawa. And also, of course, Okinawa was a central logistical point for the Vietnam War. So there were huge amounts of supplies and whatnot going through Vietnam. And of course, even eventually now we know things like Agent Orange actually affected the island of Okinawa, because they brought the stuff back and stored it there, and it actually contaminated that island also.
Well, nowadays our attention is on the Middle East, and under the banner of fighting terrorism, we have increasing involvement. But when you're talking about ISIS, this isn't just about the videos of people being beheaded in the Middle East. Mm-hmm. People see ISIS as generating acts of terror, mm-hmm. in the United States and Western Europe. So mm-hmm. a lot of people believe this is protecting Americans in their own country.
Well, I think if you actually look at the history of what happened, ISIS came directly out of our occupation of Iraq. In fact, it was formed in our detention centers in Iraq. And actually, some of the people, the reason they use those orange jumpsuits when they execute people is because they are mocking what we did in Guantanamo and in Bagram and in Abu Ghraib and multiple sites around Iraq. So the reality is that they are actually a product of our occupation of Iraq. And in fact, the leadership of ISIS literally rose up to power as the surge, which is always given as this great success, was actually eliminating the leadership above them. So the ISIS organization literally came out of a decapitated al-qaida in Iraq. And so when you look at it that way, you see, and of course, Osama bin Laden himself originally was a CIA asset. He was part of a program to give the Russians a bloody nose, like we got a bloody nose in Vietnam.
He was fighting in Afghanistan, of course. The other thing that's going on here is the longer history, even going back before World War II, mm-hmm. because what we're hearing now, whether it's in Yemen or Syria, Iraq, we're hearing about Sunni versus Shia Muslims, and there are some other subsets of people. So how does that play into what's going on with the terrorists, as we call them?
It's certainly true that going all the way back to World War I, there was a secret agreement between the British and the French, which they came to in 1916, as the famous Lawrence of Arabia was promising the Arab peoples of the Arab Peninsula that they would be able to have a government of their own and rule themselves. And the result of that, of course, was that we created Syria for the French and Iraq for the British. The first heavy bombing of civilians in a counterinsurgency actually took place in Iraq. It was actually done by Winston Churchill in the 1920s. And they installed an Arab king there who did not last very long, just a couple of decades. And it was then in the confusion that the Saddam Hussein's party then came to power in Iraq. So these colonial efforts absolutely took what had been three Ottoman provinces, the Kurds and the Shiites and the Sunnis, each had their separate provinces underneath the Ottoman Empire, which collapsed in World War I and was replaced by these French and British colonial states. And so that was the root. And of course, that was exactly what ISIS was attempting to erase, was the boundary line between Iraq and Syria when they declared their caliphate in Raqqa. And it is, of course, Raqqa, which is now about to be besieged with literally different armies. There's a Turkish force which has penetrated down into Syria, which is on one side of Raqqa. There are the Kurds coming in across the northern part of Syria. And there are these U.S. Forces that are with them and which are using air power to help them. And the Syrian army is coming in from the west.
Talk about Yemen. We have a national government. We have insurgents.
Yes.
And then when you look behind them, you see another layer. I mean, they're proxies for these other countries, whether it's Saudi Arabia or Morocco. I mean, it's a mess, isn't it?
It is quite complex, and this was actually, of course, dramatically the raid that just took place, in which the president was talking about the death of this Navy SEAL, Owens, who was killed in that raid. And of course, there was a little 8-year-old girl who was actually an American citizen because her father was killed in Yemen by a drone strike, and her brother also, who was 16 years old earlier, several years before. And so in that raid, we were actually attacking people who are basically Sunnis, who are in that village and in that surrounding area. It's actually a whole clan network of people. And in fact, Anwar al-Awlaki, who was this spokesperson for al-qaida in the Arabian Peninsula, who was the father who was killed of these two children who have now been killed, was related to this clan and had some relationship with them apparently, and they actually helped him to get away from our forces at one point. So there's a real possibility that this is actually a retaliatory aid against this particular clan of people that was carried out by our forces.
I'm going to ask you finally for some perspective because these weekly vigils have been going on for decades.
Almost, it's like 18 years. This will be the 19th year. And it all goes back, of course, to the sanctions which were put against Iraq after the first Gulf War under H.W. Bush. And so people were protesting that these sanctions were so serious. And in fact, the UN overseers of these programs that were supposed to see that things were getting to the Iraqis that they really needed to save lives actually resigned in protest because the sanctions were so harsh. And of course, there actually was a whole secret bombing campaign that also took place under Bill Clinton. People don't realize how extensively we were actually bombing Iraq during that time period. So anyway, literally hundreds of thousands of people died in Iraq just because they didn't have simple medicines for things like dysentery.
Well, we should let our viewers know if they want to find out more, they can either go online or go to one of your
Yes.
vigils. Maybe you can tell us when the next vigil is coming
The
up?
next vigil, we do this every week from 1 to 2 o'clock. And so we are right there on Boston Common, underneath the clock, which is at the
Church and Park
church
Street.
right there at Park Street Station. And so we're there and we welcome anyone to come and stand with us or visit us. There is always a microphone, and we open it up to anybody who would like to speak, as long as they are, going to talk about peace and justice.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
James Van Looy from the Committee for Human Rights. Up ahead, Vida Hispana with Maga Troncoso.